When evening came, he was there alone. But by this time the boat, battered by the waves, was far from the land, for the wind was against them. And early in the morning he came walking towards them on top of the lake. But when the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified, saying, "It is a ghost." And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." He said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat, started walking on the water, and came towards Jesus. But when he noticed the strong wind, he became frightened, and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Jesus immediately reached out his hand and caught him, saying to him, "You have little faith, why did you doubt?" When they got into the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat paid him homage, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks. I titled it, "It Ain't One and Done," but that's probably not the real message, but I titled it early for Barb in the week because I got to give her a title. So it ain't one and done in one sense, because we'll note that Peter starts out a success. His heart is so great, he gets a little ahead of his head. And then his head catches up and he starts to sink. And if you remember Peter, he does this time and time and time again. You remember when Jesus is being tried, he says, "Lord, I will never forsake you." And Jesus says, "Oh, please. The cock will crow 3 times. You'll deny me 3 times before the cock crows in the morning." And he says, no. And sure enough, he does. And God bless Peter. I don't know if you have some Peter in you. I have some Peter in me. He does it again and again. Jesus always reaches in and saves him. At the end of the book of John, of course, it's Jesus on the beach with Peter telling Peter, "Despite all the times that you've stumbled and fallen, it's you that I have chosen to feed my sheep and to feed my lambs." But as always here, there's a deeper meaning. If we focus on the miracle of Jesus walking on the water, I think we miss the deeper point of what's going on here. I didn't learn this in seminary, but as I've gotten a little more years under my belt, I started thinking about this. And the miracle here really isn't so much Jesus walking on the water, but it's that Peter walks on the water too. Peter, a normal human being just like you and I. And if Peter can walk on the water, then so can you and I. Can I get my next slide? This is actually the Sea of Galilee. So you'll notice in the story, Jesus says, "You guys go on ahead, go on across the lake, and I'm going to hang back, and I'll dismiss the crowds, and I'll catch up with you later." And if we look in most of the Gospels, anytime Jesus sends the disciples across the lake, it means he's sending them forward to a new lesson, a new level of understanding, a new level of transformation, and a new level of faith. And so they get out and start rowing against the wind and the waves. And what does Jesus do? He goes to a quiet place to pray by himself. It's almost like, I'm sending you out to learn this lesson, and you're going to need some help. You're going to need some prayer. And he stays back and he prays for them. Jesus is always teaching this little ragtag bunch lessons. There's always lessons. He spends 3 years tromping around the dusty roads in Palestine, teaching them lessons. And now you and I this morning in Parma, Idaho, 2,000 plus years, are being dragged along into the lesson. Jesus is always teaching us lessons too. He was teaching them lessons through the normal everyday things of life, right? Yeast, corn, seeds, wheat. And this is going to be a biggie. And so It's 4 a.m. in the morning, and they're rowing against the wind and the waves. And actually, it's not that big a deal. They're fishermen, they're used to it. This is chaos. In Jewish theology, water always represents chaos. But they're rowing along, and then they see something happening that's not supposed to happen. They see some dude walking on the water. And instead of saying, oh, it's Jesus, thank heavens, instead they're terrified. They're terrified, and they say it's a ghost. And Jesus says, it's not a ghost. Take heart, take courage. It's me. There's a lesson in here. I was in the Navy for 27 years, and I was on an aircraft carrier for a year plus or so. And I used to have to stand this watch called the Integrity Watch. And it was a really crappy watch that was given to the junior officers because nobody else wanted to do it. And basically, from about midnight till 8 a.m., you had this little office that you sat in, and every 30 minutes, or maybe it was every hour, you had to walk out onto the aircraft carrier deck, and you would have to go and inspect the chains on all the aircraft. You know, these aircraft are expensive, $50, $100 million, $200, $300 million aircraft, and they had to be chained to the deck. And I don't know, Nathan, on smaller ships if this was true, but the decks are greasy. It's a steel deck, but there's aircraft landing, there's oil, there's gasoline. And at 4 a.m., it was pretty scary. Your eyes start to see weird things at night. I remember one night going out, and I was walking through the maze of aircraft, and my boots are slick, and we were in, and you think of an aircraft carrier 1,000 feet long, made of steel. I still don't quite understand how they float. I don't. I know it has to do with displacement and the weight of the water. You know, Gary can maybe explain it to me sometime. The weight of the water is greater than the weight of the ship. Is that? I don't know how it works, but I do know that when the seas are 30 feet, that thing will actually, it will start doing this. And when you're walking around at night at 4 o'clock in the morning on a greasy deck, and I remember I was looking at an aircraft chain on an S3 Viking, and I was looking at it, and I looked up, and the ship pitched, and I was close to the edge of the flight deck. And I looked, and this sounds very dramatic, and it actually was. Lightning struck at that very minute and lit up the ocean in the Mediterranean, which we called it the bathtub, because it's pretty shallow, actually, and it's wide, and when the wind kicks up, it's like a bathtub. You know, the waves, it was 30 feet, and I remember the lightning struck, and there was this black sea, and the sea went yawning away from me. And it's at that point that I can imagine, 4 o'clock in the morning, it is not a cool time to get out and start walking on the water. But it's 4 o'clock in the morning, and what does Peter do? Peter says something pretty astounding. He says, if it's you, tell me to get out of this pretty comfortable, reliable boat, and tell me to walk to you, command me. And of course, Jesus doesn't. Jesus gives him an invitation, and Jesus says, come. And on the power of that one word, Peter gets out of a perfectly good boat, and he starts to walk on the water. And it's here, I think, where we find the meaning or the lesson in our story. As long as Peter kept his eyes on Jesus, he was able to walk. He was able to walk on top of the chaos of the wind and the waves. But as soon as he took his eyes off of Jesus, that's when he started to sink. I don't know about you, but if you're like me, you struggle sometimes keeping your eyes on Jesus, the true message of Jesus, and you get distracted with other little things. I had two counselings and one sort of friendly chat with a friend this week our world is crazy, right? And I know every generation says, oh boy, it didn't used to be like this. And yeah, it did. I mean, World War I was pretty bad. An archduke gets assassinated and the world's like, I think the world is pretty messed up right now. How do we survive? I was talking with 3 different people who are dealing with toxic people in their lives. How do you deal with toxic people in your life whose mission it seems to be to pick on you and make you miserable? Where do you find your relief from the chaos there? Artificial intelligence, pandemics, elections. We lose focus on the peace that Jesus offers, I believe. And the salvation and the peace that Jesus offers is, can I get my next slide? This is such a corny saying, I used to think, but you know what? To me, it's so true now. Jesus saves. When we take our eyes off of the true message of Jesus, and we start focusing on other things, even as individuals, even as a church, when we take our eyes off of the true message of the gospel of Jesus, we're going to get lost. I think, for me, the lesson that is being taught here is that you and I can walk on the water too, as long as we keep our eyes focused on Jesus. As I leave you with this, I was thinking about this morning. This is a lesson that we have to get in our bones. Do you know that you have a God and a friend who loves you unconditionally no matter how bad you peter it or how many times? Do you know in your bones that God is more for you and in your corner than you even are for yourself? That's the lesson that I think we're being taught this morning. And if we pay attention to that lesson and we get that lesson in our bones, I think occasionally we'll all be able to walk on water too, individually and together. Amen.